Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Fontaine, the CEO here at the Center for New American Security. We have a panel discussion this afternoon about the state of one of the most important relationships in U.S. foreign policy, and that is the one with India. As those who have worked in or around the U.S. India relationship over the years know, for about 25 years now, there's been a concerted effort among administrations of both parties in the United States, of governments of different kinds in India, to transform the U.S. India relationship. This was often seen in Washington as one key to responding to China and to the challenges of security in the Indo-Pacific. We're in a different place now in the bilateral relationship. There's a trade dispute that continues to go on, no trade deal in the offing, some words being going back and forth and other things like that. Some people have said that the bilateral relationship is in the lowest point in the past 25 years. So we'll talk about now what the state of the relationship is, and then what, if anything, can and should be done about where we are. So I'm joined today by several great experts to talk about this. Lisa Curtis is Senior Fellow and Director of CNAS's Indo-Pacific program. She was before that the Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for South and Central Asia in the first Trump administration. Lindsay Ford is Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation America, and she was the Senior Director for South Asia in the last administration. And Tanvi Madan is Senior Fellow in the Center for Asia Policy Studies at Brookings. All of us, recently visited New Delhi for senior level consultations to get a sense for the state of the relationship and how it looks on both sides here. So we have a lot to discuss. We'll jump in just a second here into the conversation with our panelists, and then we'll turn to the audience for questions. For those who are watching online, you can participate by entering questions in the chat box. It's cnas.org/live, or on Twitter using hashtag CNAS2025, and then they magically appear on this iPad I have in front, and I'll try to work some things in here. So thank you guys for joining us, and I think this is an important discussion about an important relationship at an important time. Why don't you set the stage, Lisa? Where are we in terms of the U.S.-India relationship today, and how does that contrast or compare with the past number of years that both sides have been kind of building this relationship to be closer?
Well, thank you, Richard. And I think you said it correctly, that the U.S.-India relationship is probably in the worst shape it's been in almost 25 years. There have been crises in the past between the U.S. and India in the last 2 decades. I'm thinking about the Devyani Khobragade episode. That was certainly a crisis in the relationship around 2013. Even during the Biden administration, there was the crisis precipitated by the alleged Indian plot to assassinate Sikh activists on U.S. soil. So we have seen challenges to the relationship, but I think this point feels worse. I think, that's for several reasons. I think one is because expectations were so high that President Trump would be good for the U.S.-India relationship. And that was based on what happened during the first Trump administration. I think we really saw an elevation of the U.S.-India relationship during that period. You had a very successful visit by President Trump to India in February 2020. You had the U.S. pulling out all stops to support India during its time of crisis with China, also in the spring of 2020. You had the Howdy Modi event in 2019, which really displayed sort of the personal rapport between President Trump, Prime Minister Modi. And so you could say by the time President Trump left office after his first term in January 2021, U.S.-India relations were at an all-time high. And of course, he had built on 25 years of investment by both Democratic and Republican presidents into that relationship. So I think, it came as quite a surprise when President Trump began to put this severe pressure on India, really on all fronts, whether it was the 50% tariffs on India, which means India is facing some of the highest tariffs in the world right now. Also, the fact that President Trump invited Chief Marshal of Pakistan, Asa Munir, to the Oval Office just weeks after a major terrorist attack in Indian Kashmir. You also saw some really degrading and insulting social media posts by senior Trump administration officials back in August. So, you know, it really is disappointing to see how far this relationship has deteriorated. And I think when we see tomorrow President Putin visiting India, we're going to see some of the results of that deterioration. Certainly, you know, it's bad timing for Prime Minister Modi to be hosting President Putin, given that Putin is escalating the war in Ukraine. We've seen threats of drones and cyber attacks in Europe. So it's very unfortunate timing and is not helpful from the American and European perspective, of course. But at the same time, it's not so surprising to see India turning toward its traditional partner in Russia due to all the pressure the U.S. has been putting on India. I think, you know, India values its strategic autonomy. It's, you know, demonstrating it's not going to be bullied by the United States. So unfortunately, I think things look pretty tough right now.
Let me just ask you one more question before we move on to Lindsay and Tanvi. So you, I think, established pretty well that the tenor coming out of the first Trump administration toward India is very different than the tenor coming out of the second administration. How do you explain that? I mean, you were in the first Trump administration, same president. You said ended his term with the closest the U.S.-India relations have ever been, and now on his watch you say that it's the lowest it's been in 25 years. So how did we get from one to the other under the same president?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. And, you know, at the beginning of this Trump administration, things were going pretty well. Prime Minister Modi visited Washington. You had good meetings between he and President Trump, a good joint statement. Things seemed to be going pretty well. And it was after the 4-day conflict between India and Pakistan that the U.S.-India relationship really started going south. And I think that's how President Trump handled the aftermath of that conflict. I think the way he asserted that it was, you know, his involvement, that he had used trade to threaten the two countries into making a ceasefire, ending the war, you know, this demonstrated a lack of either understanding or sensitivity to India's core positions on, you know, fundamental strategic concerns. And, you know, if he, in the past, the U.S. has handled conflicts between India and Pakistan behind the scenes in a less public manner. Yes, the U.S. has helped to walk the two countries back from the brink of conflict in the past, but it was done in a much quieter way. So I think President Trump's you know, penchant to want to be so public, and I think his desire to want a Nobel Peace Prize, you know, caused him to really overstate the case. And then, you know, that was followed by what I talked about earlier, the meeting with Asa Munir. So I think the handling of the aftermath of that conflict has had an impact on the U.S.-India relationship. And I think President Trump was simply angry, couldn't understand why he wasn't getting credit, why he wasn't being nominated for a Peace Prize by India. But of course, you know, if you understand India's position on this, they have not supported third-party mediation in many, many years. And their position is that this is a bilateral conflict to be only dealt with at the bilateral level. So I think that's one of the fundamental reasons. And then in terms of the trade deal, I think, you know, perhaps the fact that he was able to get concessions out of countries like Japan and South Korea made him have higher expectations for the India trade deal. I think those two issues.
Lindsay, let me ask you two questions, which maybe you can answer together. So, one, do you agree with the diagnosis of the state of affairs that Lisa just laid out? I mean, so to paraphrase, rather than a deterioration of a remarkably important relationship to the United States being rooted in some new calculation of national interests, it's, at least in part, a fit of presidential pique and anger at getting insufficient credit for diplomacy during the conflict between India and Pakistan. So one, do you agree that that has been the sort of driver or the major driver? And the other is, okay, so what? So why is the U.S.-India relationship? We used to, I think we used to not have to articulate the case for the relationship anymore because it seemed so much of a consensus in Washington, one, that China was a strategic challenge to the United States over the long haul, and that two, among the answers to that challenge was closer partnerships and allies with key countries, among which India was particularly important. So that's one answer, but for those who say, okay, well, why is this relationship so important? Why is it? Why should we try to do anything different than is currently the case? What is your answer to that?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I do agree with Lisa's assessment of, how did we get here? How did this all go so wrong in an unexpected way? I think the one thing that I would add to that is to say, in terms of why are we still here and how do we get out of this? The title of this event said, natural allies, question mark? This is a phrase that has been frequently used in the U.S.-India relationship. When I went to India when I was at the NSC, in the last week I was on the job, and Jake Sullivan went out there, we did a speech on the U.S.-India relationship, and we addressed this phrase directly, specifically because it has often been tossed out that this is sort of a natural relationship. And I would argue, and I think anyone who's worked in the U.S. government on this relationship would say there is like nothing easy or natural about how we got to where we are. It takes an awful lot of work, and it has taken high-level champions in both governments to get this relationship to the point that it was at. And I think part of what you are seeing right now in our sort of inability to figure out how do we get out of this morass is it's unclear who the high-level champions are right now in the U.S. government for this relationship. And I think in Delhi, the folks who were seen as the high-level champions of the U.S.-India relationship have been batted back a little bit, because the narrative right now in India is like, look, you guys told us that this bet on the U.S. was worth making, and see, we told you they were going to disappoint us, and they have. And so I think part of how we get out of where we are is there's going to have to be some folks on both sides at the political level, not a bureaucratic level, who decide it is worth figuring out how to reinvest in this relationship and move us forward. And I unfortunately don't see that happening in a concerted way at the moment. Why? Why would I argue that that is worth your time? I would say that if you believe that the rise of China presents a generational challenge to U.S. security and prosperity, and I believe that to be the case. If you believe that the rise of China presents a fundamental structural challenge for India, then I don't see how either the United States or India achieve the goals that we have for ourselves. The whole idea of making America great, and making India great. What was it? MAGA plus MEGA equals mega. If you believe though that
I'm still working on it.
Yeah, you'll get there. That China is a fundamental challenge to our own goals for ourselves, then a closer U.S.-India relationship is essential. I personally think the United States will never have the stable and beneficial balance of power we are looking for in the Indo-Pacific region if you do not have a strong India that is more aligned with the United States. It matters not just militarily, it matters politically on all kinds of issues where India could lean more toward sort of the SCO, BRICS, could lean more toward the United States and European allies on different issues. It matters that India is, in its multi-aligned stance, broadly aligned with the United States when we need it to be. And I think for India, the reality is if it wants to achieve its goals of not just being an Indo-Pacific power, but a global power in the future, then you need a closer tech relationship with the United States. You need a closer defense and military relationship with the United States. You can have a great relationship with Europe, you can have a great relationship with Japan and other Asian countries, but there are certain things that right now just aren't fungible because you get a better sort of partnership and better technology from the United States than you're going to get anywhere else. So the way I've been thinking about it, I don't know if anyone else enjoys rom-coms. I do. There's a great one on television right now called Nobody Wants This. And I sort of have been thinking about that as like the, tagline for the closer U.S.-India partnership right now. It is one that we both really need, and we've got to reconvince ourselves that it matters.
Was there a happy ending in that? Or have you not gotten to the end of the rom-com?
So season 2 ended with a cliffhanger, sort of like where we are right now in the U.S.-India relationship.
Typical streaming. Tanvi, two questions for you. One is, so these descriptions of how we got to where we are largely put the onus on U.S. and U.S. actions and the administration. Does accepting that we are witnessing a particularly low moment in U.S.-India relations, does India have any responsibility for having gotten to where we are? Or is this all just a function of what the U.S. has done and said and things like that? So that's one. And then the other is, when we were in New Delhi a few weeks ago, people were speaking a lot, very openly about Prime Minister Modi's visit to China, the first of his to China in 7 years. He literally held hands with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Some interpreted that as a signal to the United States. We have options. These are the kinds of things that we will be doing more of if we don't have a close relationship with you. But other people sort of dismiss this and say, India's never going to align with China. I mean, look at their border issue, and look at Chinese support for Pakistan, and look at the Indian Ocean, look at all the things that divide them. And on Russia, well, they had a relationship with Russia before all this spat that we're in now. So yeah, Putin's coming to India, but how much of the Indian approach to Russia and China is really driven by its relationship, good or bad, with the United States?
Thanks, Richard. And it's great to be with all of you, and it was on the trip as well. I think the way, I'll step back and put this slightly differently. I think, if you think about how India views the world and its objectives, you've always seen India have kind of these goals of security, prosperity, status, but also autonomy. And so it has always wanted to maintain a diversified portfolio of partners. What people call multi-alignment, what used to be called non-alignment, essentially it was a strategy of diversification. And part of that has always meant that these other relationships are going to be maintained, some of which we like with Europe, unless, some American defense companies might not like that if the French are getting something, but broadly, with Europe, with Japan, with Australia, with ROK, and with other, U.S. allies and partners in the region, and some of which we don't particularly like, right? Russia or China, unless we're engaging with Russia and China. So I think some of it is, if you think about even this time last year, it was pretty evident that after President Trump had come to office, that there was going to be, because of India's experience, even in the first Trump term, about, yes, things were ended up really well, but there was some volatility and uncertainty over time, that there were a few things that India was going to do. And there were three things. One, doubling down on building up India's own capacities. Second, doubling down on diversification. And third is trying to stabilize ties with China. Not that they were going to make up, I think it was going to be selective re-engagement to ensure that things don't go awry there. And I think Xi Jinping had a similar interest because he was uncertain about what incoming whether it was a Trump or Harris administration was going to do about China. I think what you've essentially seen especially with the Russia visit, but I think in Indian engagement over this whole year has been with partners, is that doubling down on diversification. So we noticed here the Putin visit to India a lot. We notice a lot, the Modi visit to China. We don't tend to notice trips that frankly have been more substantive than, say, a Xi-Modi handshake. We don't notice the Modi trip to Japan, which was really substantive. We don't notice that the Indian defense minister was just in Australia, that the Indian shipbuilding minister was in ROK, that, India and Europe might actually, shock and awe, get a trade agreement done. And I didn't know if that would get done in my lifetime. So I would put the Putin visit to Russia in that context, that it is about ensuring that Russia investment that India has had will continue and maybe even expand in certain sectors. So is this problematic? Will people object here? Absolutely. Will the Europeans be upset? Absolutely. I think on Russia, but also to some extent on Pakistan, these are two areas, and Lindsay has said this before, that when they are central in this relationship, when these are kind of what people are talking about, it's never a good sign. And my way of thinking about it is if India gives Pakistan a veto on the U.S.-India relationship, and if the U.S. gives, or Europe gives Russia a veto on ties with India, then you have a relationship that essentially will please neither the West nor India. The only people who will be happy about that are Beijing and Moscow. So what is India going to try to? I think, one, it's very much part of their diversification strategy. Putin's trip is about giving Russia some non-China options. It is about, I think for Putin, it is about the defense side a lot more, in terms of, he does want to sell more defense equipment. We've seen this, we saw this in the late 80s, early 90s even, when the Soviets really needed the revenue. They really went full court press on selling platforms. I'm skeptical about certain platforms. I do think India will buy additional S-400s, but they also want the Russians to deliver the ones that were promised. I don't think, I'm skeptical, I could be proven wrong, that India is going to buy Sukhoi 57s, as the Russians are insisting that they will. I do think, there are some reports that India and Russia have finally, which has been under, negotiations for almost a decade, will sign a logistics support agreement. That's something people will have to figure out how that gels with India's other engagements to do more together in the Arctic and in the Indian Ocean. Now, one thing that's going to be complicated for India, guess who Russia is working with, who's been working with in Arctic and Indian Ocean? China. So I'm not sure how that gels, but this is the kind of, I think you'll see on the defense side, maybe something on shipbuilding, maintenance, repair, overhaul on that front. I think the sense I get on kind of the Indian side on the Russia trip, most of the emphasis seems to have been on the economic side, which is, yes, there's been a lot of oil imports, but guess what's happened? The trade deficit for India and Russia, for India with Russia, has ballooned from about $6 billion a few years ago to $65 billion or $60 billion in the last year. India's deficit with Russia is now only second to its deficit with China, which is about 100 billion. So what is India trying to do? India is trying to get the Russians to buy more from India. They don't really buy, they buy about $5 billion worth of goods from India. That's clearly not enough for India. So part of it is, I think, India is trying to say buy more pharma goods, buy more agricultural goods, marine products, some of which, have been hit by U.S. tariffs. But also, I think, they will try to say there are all these rupees that the Russians have in Indian banks. They're going to find ways to get the Russians to invest this in the Indian economy or in Indian bonds and equities. And frankly, this is an unanticipated outcome that we will have to face of sanctions and pressure on India about this, which is they might, and I think they will reduce oil imports because of sanctions, and private sector companies will make those decisions. But inadvertently, we will end up perhaps broadening the India-Russia economic relationships in ways that nobody might have intended, but will be the outcome. Having said that, there are real limits to the Russia-India relationship, which, as people react to this Putin visit, are worth keeping in mind. This is a country that is best friends with India's primary adversary. That sets certain limits. the Russians have sold more military equipment to the Pakistanis in the last few years than the US has. And India's own ties with the West will impose limits for the Russians in terms of how much they move. Some of this will depend on how I think the West reacts, but I also think, let's see, there'll be some announcements, what actually gets implemented. Finally, just on your point, so I would say, put this visit in perspective. There will be a lot of advancement. India will roll out the red carpet. I hope there have been pre-briefs and debriefs of India's friends in the West. If not, I think there will be a worse reaction. But the one thing I will say about kind of the India-Russia relationship, the only thing that only way the West has succeeded in getting India to do less with Russia is to give India better options and Indians better options. And so that is a choice. Now, the question is, going back to the discussion here, is that something folks are interested in here? And that, I think, is an open question.
Great. One more question for you, Tanvi, and then we're going to go back to the line because there's some questions that have come in that I want to pose to Lisa and to Lindsay. But I keep thinking about the things that we told ourselves about the U.S.-India relationship. One, there was a consensus in Washington. Two, there was a consensus in New Delhi. Three, that this was in part driven by China. There was a consensus on China, all these other things. And now we're like, did that really exist? But the other one was that in the U.S.-India relationship, there was a whole lot of ballast outside the political level, right? Indian Americans were more politically active. Business on both sides was driving this relationship forward. Defense business, but all kinds of other business. And so we were unlikely to get to a particularly bad point because you had all of these other ties and you had people who were influential in the policy process and politically that would push things back in a better direction. So now, assuming that you agree that we're at a very low moment in the U.S.-India relationship, what about the Indian American community? What about the business community? Well, how did that happen?
So I think one, I don't know how to describe this moment. The way I put it is it's a challenging moment, but there's this weird dichotomy where there's all this tension and functional cooperation is just continuing. Mm-hmm. It's just, you had, and even unprecedented stuff, at least that I know of, this might be something that has been happening. But if you told me, I'm steeped right now in writing a book and I'm steeped in documents from the early 1980s, and there's a lot of Indian complaining about the U.S. and operating and expanding facilities in Diego Garcia. And it's like, this is terrible. It's even worse than the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The U.S. needs to get out. Well, a month ago, an Indian P-8 was taking off from Diego in an exercise and a patrolling anti-submarine warfare exercise with the U.S. Navy. So these things are continuing. Now, I don't know how long that you can keep that disconnect between, the political, the leadership-driven, and the functional cooperation. But nonetheless, to me, this moment is, this debate about how fragile the relationship, but also how resilient the relationship still is. Because if all of this had happened 10 years ago, we wouldn't even be talking about that a trade deal might be possible, that defense exercises have continued, that the Malabar exercise still happened. In terms of the breadth, I will say, I think one thing that's challenging about this moment, and part of it is these other factors, kind of, why haven't you seen the American business community that is invested speak up, or kind of say, look, because they would speak up, they used to speak up about China relations, right? That, why is this happening? I actually I have a disagreement. I know some in India have said, the Indian American community needs to speak up about this. One, that the Indian government needs to press the Indian American community. No, because that's illegal and people shouldn't do that. But I think the other thing is, you do not want a relationship where only the diaspora is actually speaking up. This is a relationship that actually is and should be broader than just the diaspora. I think I am a member of the diaspora. I think they contribute to kind of society in various different ways. But I don't think it should just be incumbent. I think anybody's benefiting, and you're seeing that, right? You're seeing there are presidents of universities that have a number of Indian students. The highest number of students last year, international students, were from India. Now, part of the problem, I think, why this is challenging is every one of those aspects of the relationship have become more charged in our politics. And it's not just about kind of the Indian American community. It is, if American businesses speak up, it is, why are American businesses going and investing abroad? If it's international students, well, we want less international students here, not more, even though, including in some red states, they contribute a lot to the economy and to their ability to do R&D and to help innovate. And there's this idea, and we're seeing this kind of online, right, that you're seeing kind of this, I don't know how much of this is genuine, that people feel this way, or it's kind of bots and stuff, perhaps even from bot farms in India, as we're finding out, generating this kind of anti-India hate in a way that we haven't seen for a while. I don't know, it's unprecedented. There are others in the room who've been here a lot longer. So, you know, I think where the diaspora matters is, you know, it used to be pointed to as a sign of kind of closeness. It was the bridge, the living bridge. But the thing with diasporas always is, and there's histories of this with other countries, which is it can be a bridge, but it can start to become, that bridge can, if you start doing damage, and this can be both ways, right? If you have a diaspora that is seen as a problem here and people are attacking it, suddenly the people in India are like, well, they don't like Indians. And you know, if you were aspiring, you have family members, that was supposed to be a good thing. On the reverse, if India starts playing politics with the diaspora here, that starts harming the broader relationship as well, as we saw kind of last year. So I think the diaspora, you know, it's one aspect of the relationship. To me, the big missing element has been, it's not just the things that have happened, it's the thing that has been missing, right, which comes to China. The big reason why the US and India would set aside differences, manage differences, even when things were bad, say we need to keep going. Yes, it was India's market size. Yes, it was, you know, the diaspora. Yes, it was, but it was this shared strategic convergence that in rising China's assertiveness was a shared challenge, and that both sides needed to work together to deal with it. And I think the jury is at, like, if you asked me what our policy towards China is, I couldn't tell you. And so, you know, that as a driver, to me, one thing we know from every president when it comes to India, it is what is their organizing principle, what is the prism through which they see the world. And for the last few presidents, including President Trump in his first term, eventually was competition with China for the administration. And that led to cooperation, that led to managing differences. And I don't think we know yet where that will land, even though there is kind of all this functional cooperation and parts of various buildings are still dedicated to this. I don't know that we know where the president is on this.
I've got two online questions. One I'm going to pose to Lindsay, and then one to Lisa. So, and then we'll go to the audience. So be thinking about questions if you have them. Lindsay, there's a question here from Satvik. What's the argument for closer U.S. and India defense partnership beyond some occasional co-production and intelligence sharing if it doesn't result in at-scale capabilities? It seems like right up your alley. So,
Well, I would say this. I actually don't think that there is a strong argument for the U.S.-India defense relationship if it does not result in greater capability at scale for India, and that capability operating more frequently with the United States in a way that deters China militarily. Those are the things. India needs capability. I personally believe it is in U.S. interest for India to have more capability, even when they're not operating it alongside us, because frankly, a stronger India militarily is a more effective deterrent toward China. So we should want that. But also, we want India to be operating with us. The whole reason the United States gives capabilities to other countries is, you know, not just, sorry, my industry friends, for us to make money. It is because we believe that those are countries who we are going to have a closer operational relationship with. And so, to me, that's the whole thing. That's the vision in the long run. You know, the idea of sharing information is also has to be a two-way street with India and with any country. So if you're not driving toward something that we're sharing information, we're operating alongside each other, India is benefiting from access to U.S. facilities and the U.S. can benefit from access to Indian facilities, then it doesn't add up to a lot. So you have to get there.
Lisa, there's a question from Stephen. How should the U.S. balance its relationships with India and Pakistan in order to preserve both?
Good question. Look, I think it made sense for the Trump administration to consider how it could improve ties with Pakistan. Relations had really been pretty moribund during the Biden administration between the U.S. and Pakistan. So it made sense to try to improve that relationship. Certainly the United States doesn't want to see Pakistan go totally in China's camp. But that doesn't have to happen at the expense of U.S.-India relations. And I think, why that has happened, I don't want to repeat what I said in my first or opening remarks, is that the U.S. really kind of sided with Pakistan after this most recent conflict. And that did not have to happen. I think that, that really was where the Trump administration erred. It wasn't so much that there's been some improvement in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. I think that's welcome. But I think the U.S. should have been more careful in its response to the India-Pakistan conflict and more neutral and handled it in a way that both sides could save face. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. So I think the U.S. can focus on improved counterterrorism cooperation with Pakistan, some economic and trade improvements, as well as people-to-people ties. So there are things that the U.S. and Pakistan can do together. But I think the Trump administration should really ensure that that's not going to come at the expense of its relationship with India. Because let's face it, India is the more important strategic partner for the United States over the long term. It's India that is the fifth fastest growing economy. It's India that has the fourth most powerful military. It's India that is, the most populous democracy, functioning, healthy democracy in the region. And it's India that we want to have the capabilities to stand up to China. Just as Lindsay was saying, I think that is the most important part of our defense relationship, is that India has those capabilities. We want India to be able to defend itself against China. And I think another thing that we need to recognize is that, yes, India and the United States share converging interests and concerns about a rising China. That doesn't mean that the U.S. can put as much pressure as it wants on India because, India somehow needs the U.S. to defend against China. I don't think it's that simple. And unfortunately, I think there's some in the Trump administration who believe that, who believe, it's fine, we can put pressure on India, lob some insults, et cetera, because, in the end, they need us to defend against China. That's not on the mark. India has been able to protect itself from China for, many, many years. And, but what I think what we risk is if India feels it cannot rely on the United States, then we force India to accommodate China more, which is something that's not in the United States' interest, right? If we force India to, accommodate on its border disputes with China or on trade and investment, because, and that sends a signal to the rest of the region. They see, oh, wow, if India can't count on the United States, we can't either, so therefore we better accommodate China as well. And so then by losing India, we're actually damaging our own Indo-Pacific strategy, and we're making it easier for China to achieve its hegemonic ambitions in the region.
Let's go to questions here if there are some. Yes, sir, right here. There's a mic coming around, so just one moment. Just please identify yourself and then.
Sure, Cap Sharma with the Round Glass Foundation. I think we should take what Tanvi's point and Lisa's point and combine the two. I think Tanvi, you perfectly put the structure that over the last 25 years, a lot has happened structurally between the two countries. So to compare it to, we're going back 25 years, not comparing apples to apples. You just can't because of the bureaucratic exchange, everything that's been going on. Lisa, I don't think we're going back 25 years, but we can be disappointed as to how Trump is handling it. But I don't think we've gone back to 25 years. Having worked on this relationship 30 years ago, I can tell you it's not the same. But my question really is for you, Lindsay. You did great work in the Biden administration. I think actually the Biden administration was the best ever for India. Considering you took the Trump tariffs that they started, the trade deal, and you finished it, and then you gave them probably the greatest joint agreement I've ever seen, the joint statement when PM Modi came. But still, you were probably not happy with their relationship with Russia towards the end of the administration, with the oil purchases. So what would you have done differently to change India's behavior? I think it's convenient to blame Trump for a lot that's going on, but I know that you were not happy with India towards the end of the Biden administration because of Houthi participation, fighting the Houthis, and I know you were really upset about the oil purchases. So I'm curious, what would you have done differently in those 4 years, and would you have done something differently with the joint statement?
Sure. So I actually think probably the thing at the end of the Biden administration that was actually the most significant friction point over Russia was when PM Modi went to Moscow, and it happened during the NATO summit here in DC. Right. I think that was actually the biggest, challenge. I would say this. I personally think that we were fairly realistic about the fact that India was not going to suddenly not have a relationship with Russia. I think what the United States and India have to do, and I would actually say this is true for Russia and it's true for how you handle Pakistan, because I actually think how we kind of handle them as partners has to be pretty similar. One, you have to communicate in advance about anything that you know the other side will see as significant. And I would say there were definitely a couple bumps in the road where I think we could have done better at that in the US when it came to stuff with Pakistan, and I think there are things where India could have done better when it came to stuff with Russia. But you've got to be transparent up front because, quite frankly, otherwise the media ecosystem runs with a whole lot of sometimes just conspiracy theories that make it so much worse politically on both sides. The second is you can be pragmatic about the fact that we're both going to have those relationships, and yet you need to be very articulate about the ways in which we need the U.S.-India relationship to be distinct from those partnerships. So let me give you an example. I may recognize that India and Russia are going to have economic cooperation. I might even say, hey, I get that you guys have a whole lot of existing legacy defense cooperation with Russia. Are you interested in, I don't know, quantum cooperation with the United States? If so, that's very special technology for us. So we wouldn't be okay if you're doing the same kind of stuff with us on things like quantum as you're also going to do with the Russians, because that creates a vulnerability for us with technology that's very special and sensitive to us. I think India would say the same thing when it comes to, say, Pakistan, right? Like, hey, it's a major problem for me if you guys are facilitating certain kinds of technological cooperation with Pakistan, because that creates a vulnerability for us. So that, to me, is how we manage these relationships. One, no surprises. It's like the basic 101 rule of sort of like managing up when you work in government. It applies to relationships too. And two, we need to be blunt about a handful of areas where, quite frankly, we ring fence those for our relationship, and we just accept that we're not going to have that cooperation with the other partner. If we can't do that, I think we will just continue to sort of like knock our heads against the wall all the time on these two relationships.
Let's see what else we got here. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Fontaine, Ms. Curtis, Ms. Ford, and Ms. Madan for having us and sharing your insights. My name is Yash Manuja. I'm a junior at Georgetown SFS, studying international politics, and I'm also interning at AEI with Sadhan Dume. My question is, India's insistence on strategic autonomy, as you both have mentioned, means it will continue balancing relations with Moscow. But with the relos giving Russia a foothold in the Indian Ocean and a potential fifth-generation fighter cooperation on the table, what, if anything, would the U.S. consider a red line? Is there a point where Indian hedging stops being manageable and starts reshaping U.S. calculations in the Indo-Pacific?
Lisa, I'm looking at you. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm sure
and then
both will
Tom,
have
you're-
something to add.
yeah, please.
I'm thinking back when I was at the National Security Council, and the India's buying of the S-400 was quite problematic, and there was a lot of deliberation. Ultimately, they weren't sanctioned. But it was the same thing Lindsay said, is that it would limit certain technology that the U.S. could provide to India. So again, it's kind of India's choice. I mean, the further they go down the road with Russia on certain defense equipment technologies, then the more that's going to limit what the U.S. can provide to India. So it's really their choice. And, I believe that, India's future, its future needs are much better met by the United States rather than Russia. So I think, the U.S. would be a better bet in that regard. So I think that, let's see how the Trump administration reacts to this meeting tomorrow. I'm a bit nervous. I think there could be a reaction, if major deals are announced for, more S-400s, maybe the Sioux fighters, we don't know, but also whether or not India continues to reduce its reliance on Russian oil. Certainly it's gone down to some degree, but it's not clear where things are headed. And I think, President Trump is looking for it to stop, to be halted. So depending on, what happens tomorrow and how the Trump administration reacts, it could be a setback to the U.S.-India trade talks and things moving forward. Whether there's, a breaking point, I don't think so. I think India also will continue to try to balance its ties. And it's not just the United States. India's ties with Russia have a cost to its relationships with Europe. And, now that we see that European relations are very important to India in terms of trade, I think, there's costs for India on both fronts.
Just say, I was trying to make this point, perhaps not so well, and it's a great question, which is why I tried to answer it in the beginning. We should put the India-Russia relationship in context. This is not, we sometimes say, this is like the US-Soviet, this is the big relationship for India. Let me just throw out some figures. India's exports to the US last year were about $85 billion, just in goods. I'm not even including services. There were $5 billion to Russia. Even if you look at defense, which is the big leg of that relationship, take any 5 years before kind of, say, 2017, 2018, say, at the big 20 years ago, Indian imports from Russia in a 5-year period would have been three-quarters, over 75% of India's defense imports would have been from Russia. If you look at the last 5 years, and this trend, by the way, is not because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was preceding that. But the last 5 years, that number had come down to about 36%. If you look at where are Indian students going, even if it becomes tougher for them to come here, they're not lining up to go to Russia. They're lining up to go to Germany or France or UK, maybe Australia, maybe Japan these days. There might be a mobility agreement that comes out of this, Putin visit. So what is it for? Yes, it's some amount of, okay, as the Anglophone world becomes tighter and restricts immigration, India is looking for alternative markets for skilled and semi-skilled. But it's also about the fact that the Russians managed to take some Indians who went there to work and stuck them in the military and put them on the front line, and some of them got killed. And despite Putin's promises, some of them are still missing in Russia. And it's about getting that organized. But my point is, if you look at the depth and breadth of India's relationship with Russia, and we focus so much on it, the defense leg, yes, is big, but it's been shrinking, and sure, there might be some deals. And, you know, just like, as Lindsay was saying, we're going to say, okay, you can buy more, there's certain things we can't do. But at the same time, for India, they thought the S-400 performed very well during their kind of India-Pakistan crisis. They're going to buy more of it, and we just have to say, yeah, you know, we have to deal with that. So part of it is you might not accept that your friends have engagements with your adversaries. But sometimes, if you want to move ahead, you just have to tolerate it and find ways to ring fence what you can do and focus on the fact that the trends are actually in your favor. And so to me, what has made those trends possible, that Europe is India's largest market, even single-handedly larger than the US, that, you know, India's critical and emerging technology partners are Western largely, West writ large, that where India is talking about economic security and technology security is not with Russia, it's with Western partners writ large. It is because everybody, the G7 plus, has said to India, we want to do business with you, even if you haven't given up your ties with Russia. So I think, you know, these relationships, the Russia, the Pakistan, I think the one thing I would say has been, you know, and I think even on the US-Pakistan side, the trend has been not in the direction of increase. The graph has been like this. It might have come up slightly. And so for each country is, what can you do to ensure you respect the other sensitivities, have no surprises, though I'm not sure when we can have a no surprises rule in the next few years, but also to try to reinforce the things that are making your relationships more valuable to the other. So it's a great question because I think the balancing will continue, but we also have strategic autonomy here, right? We don't give India a veto on what we're doing with certain countries. So I think this is just going to be the nature of these relationships. I will say, you know, you asked, Richard, what can India do a little bit more? I think one is, you know, there are relationships, this pre-brief, debrief, kind of no surprises. I think the other thing, which there have been signs of now in India, is better business environment, more open to trade. That's how you create more constituencies here in part. You know, more kind of willingness to actually say to the US when it does want to do things, and not just the US, but other Western partners. Show some benefit of the doubt to the US like you do Russia. That's another thing. And so I think there are things, I think more law enforcement cooperation on both, you know, there are cartels, both that are in India that are, you know, have been helping enable the export from there to here of fentanyl precursors, of illegal migration. These are the kind of things we've been hearing now, much more cooperation from the Indian side. So more things that would actually, I think, say to folks here that we actually do understand what your priorities are and we're trying to work with you on them.
Open the soybean market. Would that be one?
You know, one thing I have not kind of done a deep dive into is I understand that there's some concerns. I think about kind of the GMO aspects or things like that. But I wouldn't be surprised if you saw, you know, that India, and from what we understood, and this is we heard from so many people, is that the trade deal's done and that this would actually be a very ambitious trade deal for India. And that would include purchases of agricultural products. I personally hope it also means we get more Indian mangoes. But that hope has not been met for many years, so I don't know if we'll get that. But that, I mean, I'm being facetious, but from everything we've heard, that what is on the table is really significant. And so one question is, you know, when does the president decide if or not he wants to sign that? What else is he looking at? I will say, you know, one other thing, which is I fully expect, in part because of kind of this Russia, I fully expect that you will see now in the next couple of weeks, India try to seek to do more very publicly with the US, with Japan, with Europe. Now, whether or not others, what the reaction is will determine how much, but I fully expect, because the balance doesn't just work in terms of trying to do things with Russia. It means that India has freedom of action. You don't have freedom of action or as much leverage with even your partners if you don't have a good relationship with the US. The US relationship has enabled better Indian relationships with Japan, with countries in the Middle East, with Europe, and even helped stabilize ties with China. So I fully expect that the balance, the recalibration will not just involve kind of doing more with Russia or others, but also trying to kind of keep this relationship on track.
Okay, last question for you guys, and maybe we can just go down the line here. And it's about what the U.S. can or should do next in terms of a specific policy or change or something that it's doing, it's not doing, whatever, that would improve the relationship that all of you have said is important to the U.S. And kind of a little subset of that is when you talk about the importance of the U.S.-India relationship, you all invoke China. There was none of this world's largest democracy, world's oldest democracy, we share values, business. Now, I'm not saying that you don't believe those things too, but it was not just about there's diaspora and there's these business connections. It was, we can manage the China challenge better working more closely with India than if we're not. So if we're going to have an approach to India policy that is different than the one today, are you really saying it's got to start with a new China policy? Because that's the driver of the strategic approach to India. And right now, our China policy appears to be quite different than it has been for the last number of years. So one, do we need a new China policy to get a new India policy, if that's what you think we need? And then two, what is something that the current administration could do that would sort of right the ship in your mind? So let's start with Tommy, and we'll work our way down and close up.
Look, I've written a book about how China has
available in fine bookstores everywhere and on Amazon.
And probably in ways that are not legal as well. And since we don't really do this for the money, read it however you want to read it. I shouldn't say that. But having written a book about how China has driven the U.S.-India relationship, I would say for a sustainable relationship, it shouldn't just rest on a China leg. And so broadening out the relationship to me is important. And that means, I think, in terms of what needs to be done. So yes, I would love it if we actually figured out what we were doing with China, but I do think in terms of the U.S.-India relationship, the kind of bolstering the breadth of it, but in the immediate, I do think it's important to get a trade deal done just because it is kind of that thing that is just sitting there. It is important on this kind of oil imports front, that extra, because it is seen as a sanction, not just as a tariff, that extra 25%. To me, the kind of taking away something and then actually getting the trade deal done, depending if it is as ambitious as we're hearing, even if it's just ambitious from a kind of an India point of view, that I think could just help set up this relationship. I do think, for example, there are other things in terms of the breadth. I would like to see, the next time an Indian prime minister comes to the US, go to an Indian company that's creating jobs here or buying soybean, that American farm that is selling soybeans to, or whatever they're selling to India. Because I think sometimes, there is this case that I think even in India, the case needs to be made about why is the U.S. important? Because you haven't seen the Indian government overreact or push back or insult the president. Because the government understands this is an important relationship. Sometimes I don't think that is conveyed beyond a small circle of people. So I think for this to be sustainable, it would help to really have that convergence on China. That might be a kind of a necessary but insufficient. I do think it's healthier for a relationship if it has breadth across, and if in both countries we don't have to actually be asking the question, why does this matter? That it is self-evident to people around the country.
Lindsay.
I agree with Tanvi that the relationship should be broader, but I think just on a really practical level, there are folks in both of our systems who kind of mistrust each other. I mean, that is just the reality of where we are right now. And the thing that gets us past that and kind of makes those people, have to plug their noses and do the closer cooperation anyways is the China argument. I mean, it just is. And I think when we are both unsure of where the other one is going on China policy, it makes it harder to get past the questions and the mistrust that people on both sides have to really dig in on more meaningful cooperation. And I think that's a little bit where we are right now, right? Folks on the US side are like, oh, what does it mean that PM Modi is participating in the SCO summit? And, folks here are going to ask all kinds of questions as well. I mean, on both sides, there's going to be a lot of this, looking askance at each other, and it makes it harder to move forward. In terms of what should happen next, politics is personal, and that is just especially true when it comes to this relationship and these two leaders, right? The thing that everyone remembers from the first Trump term is the leaders' visits and the optics of those. And quite frankly, I think a lot of goodwill that existed between the two leaders was because they both got those amazing moments in the sun on both sides. And so quite frankly, I think that is probably, if you want to turn the ship on this relationship, the two leaders have to feel differently about how they are being seen in each country, and they are each going to need that moment, and you've got to figure out how to get to a leader's visit, because also that is the thing that tends to focus our bureaucracies on actually getting things done.
Lisa, take us home.
Okay, so what can the U.S. do? I think first and foremost in the next 48 hours is not to overreact to the Putin visit. I really hope that there's not an overreaction from the Trump administration to what we're likely to see between Putin and Modi in the next 48 hours. Second, we've talked ad nauseum about the need for a trade deal, and I think that's right. But I think even more important is, ending the war and, emphasizing that difference. There's obviously a contradiction between India's version of events and President Trump. So if he can sort of move beyond that, move past that, and talk more about understanding India's terrorism concerns, and maybe even doing an initiative, a counterterrorism initiative with India, or whether it's, naming terrorists, designating terrorist groups or terrorist leaders. I think really signaling that the U.S. understands India's terrorism concerns and fundamental security concerns. And then thirdly, agree with Lindsay, we have to get to a leaders visit. President Trump was supposed to go in November. There was supposed to be a Quad summit. So I really hope that they can make that happen in the first quarter of next year, and particularly the Quad. And, the way the U.S. talks about the Quad and the Indo-Pacific, and really, making sure that India is part of that vision of what the Indo-Pacific is going to look like. And, we're expecting the national security strategy, the national defense strategy. I really hope that India's role in the Indo-Pacific is highlighted, because I think that will help the overall tone of the relationship.
Great. Well, thank you all. My very first job at the State Department 23 years ago was as an India desk officer. And so that does give one at this advanced stage a certain perspective. It seems to me, if I'm permitted an editorial note, this is a salvageable situation. Now, it may take a long time to rebuild trust, because the trust has always been kind of thin between the U.S. and India. However, if you look at where the relationship is, even today, compared to where it was 23 years ago, I mean, it has been light years ahead in almost any field that you would care about. And you can feel that. So my hope is that we can move through what will turn out to be a very rough patch, but then get back on track for all of the reasons that you articulated for why this relationship is so important. Please join me in thanking our panel here. And thank you all who joined us online and in person. And we'll see you next time.